Hello, I continue to run through the history of philosophy, basically following the outline of Sophie's World, a novel by Jostein Gaarder. And we've done a video on Socrates and the natural philosophers. By the way, this is a history of Western and European philosophy. There have been philosophers all over the world. There's Chinese philosophy, but again, following kind of European philosophy here. The second video was on Plato and Aristotle. That was last week. And this is the third video in that series on Hellenistic philosophies. What are Hellenistic philosophies? Why, they're philosophies of people named Helen, like my mother. No, Hellenistic means Greek. The whole world became Greekified or Hellenized after Alexander the Great conquered the world. He was born in, what was it, the late 300s. I know he died in 323. He was only 33 years old. So can you do the math there? 33. So we've been born anyway. He conquered the world when he was 33. What have I done? But anyway, Alexander left the world after he died all pretty much in Greek control. And the places that he had conquered, he basically went to India, as far as India. Of course, it wasn't India then. It was the Indus River and Hindu peoples. But his kingdom, as it were, was divided up among his followers. One of his generals was named Ptolemy, who took over Egypt. Another of his generals was named Seleucus, who took over Palestine. I'm reaching back into my memories. He had one, I think, Antipater, maybe, who took Greece. I'm trying to remember what that name was. Anyway, and so the world became Greekified. Greek became the business language of the world. English has kind of been that in the last part of the 20th century, at least. You could get by on English in a lot of places in the world, and a lot of business by knowing English. That does not at all say that English will continue to be the business language, the lingua franca. Before Greek, it was probably Aramaic would have been the Babylonian language, I believe, late Babylonian at least. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Boy, my brain is getting old. None of that, however, has to do with this video, which is about Hellenistic philosophies. These are the philosophies that followed in the train of after Aristotle. So Aristotle helped train Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great's father, Philip of Macedon, brought Aristotle up to train his son. And so the continuance of Greek philosophy after Aristotle. So Socrates dies in 399 BC. Then we have Plato's Academy. Then we have Aristotle's Lyceum. Plato's Academy continues until the Christians shut it down in, 529 AD, when the Christians basically said, nope, this is not Christian. And they shut Plato's Academy down. I think probably Sophie's World would consider that the beginning of the Dark Ages, although that's a value judgment on history, isn't it? But anyway, so Plato's Academy continues. Aristotle's Lyceum continues for, I don't know how long it continued. But we have other Greek philosophies that arise in the period, in this period after Aristotle. And you could argue that these philosophies all have some root in as heirs of Socrates. I don't remember, for example, the Cynics was founded by Diogenes. The word cynic is built off of the Greek word kune, which means dog. Paul in Philippians 3, beware of the dogs, beware of the kunes. So Diogenes the Cynic, Diogenes the dog, is one of the Hellenistic philosophies that arises after Socrates and after Plato and Aristotle as well. I forget, there is one of Socrates's characters that is kind of cynic-like. I don't remember the name, and maybe I should have done my homework. But you could argue that each of these Hellenistic philosophies, even though they didn't really grow into their own until later, after Socrates and after Plato and Aristotle, that they have roots back in the Socratic times. Well, The first of the Hellenistic philosophies that we wish to talk about in this video are the Cynics. And we think of the Cynics especially as being started by Diogenes. Now, why was he called the dog? Well, because he believed that there were a lot of human rules that were kind of made up. So, for example, who says you can't poop on your front lawn, right? I mean, who made up that rule? Anyway, well, Diogenes, I believe, did some of that stuff just to show it's a made-up rule. That was his argument. You know, go naked in public. Who says you can't go naked in public? I'll show you naked in public. So Diogenes was somebody who questioned. He basically thought that morality was made up, that society made up stuff. You know, who's to say there's a border here between the U.S. and Mexico? I don't see a line. Well, there's a river, you know, here in Texas. But so Diogenes was someone who questioned whether or not the things that society said were real were actually real. And of course, it wasn't all just, forgive me for saying it, having sex in public, you know, Diogenes. Why not? It wasn't all that kind of stuff. He also believed that society was wrong when it made you think that the people who had all the stuff were the people that were most happy. Now, this is something that, you know, I would probably, well, I would agree with as a Christian, and I think we could agree with as philosophers in general, and that is that happiness is probably not to be found in the stuff we have or in our possessions. I've sometimes told my family, money can't make you happy, but I'm willing to try. But anyway, so Diogenes wasn't entirely crazy when he says that happiness is not in possessions. And I mean, if we're fair, there are a lot of rules that society has that we think are obvious, but if you go to a different culture, they're not. And that probably indicates that we don't realize we're wearing cultural glasses on those particular issues. So that's Diogenes the Cynic. Now, words change their meaning. And of course, kune, dog, was a Greek word. So when we use the word, when we talk about somebody being cynical today, that does, I mean, that word comes from the Cynics. It does. But that doesn't mean it means the same thing today that it meant back then. We always have to keep in mind this, and I'm reminded from time to time that I've lived with these concepts for so many years that these things seem obvious to me. And so let me tell you, if you haven't realized it, the way that you use words isn't the way words have always been used. The words change their meaning over time. And so the word cynical today, it does relate to the Cynics, but it has its own life. And the word cynical is going to mean whatever we tell it to mean by the way we use it. The word cynical could mean somebody who takes out the trash. Now, it doesn't mean that yet, but who knows? Maybe this video will become viral, and in 10 years, people will say, well, I'm going to be cynical, and they go take out the trash, which I need to do when I go home, by the way. But so words change their meaning. But the word cynical today has the sense of, if somebody's cynical, they don't take anything at face value. They're constantly questioning. So let's say that you bring me you know, a sandwich, or you bring me a donut, and you're just being a nice person. There were donuts, and you brought them to me, and I say, why are you bringing me this donut? What do you want from me? What's going on here? Why are you bringing me a donut? That's a cynical attitude, somebody who doesn't take things at face value. Does that relate to Diogenes? I mean, a little bit. I mean, he basically said practices that we assume are obvious aren't necessarily obvious, but there's a difference. But so don't assume that the way that we use a word today is exactly the same as what it meant, you know, 2,300 years ago. Okay. I put this up here because when I first made these PowerPoints, probably 20 years ago, when I made this content before our PowerPoint was even around, I mentioned an old scholar from the 90s called John Dominic Crossan. I mean, he's not, he's still alive, so he probably doesn't want to think of himself as old. Sorry, Mr. Crossan. But John Dominic Crossan suggested back in the 1990s that Jesus may have been a cynic because he noticed some, by the way, I don't agree with this. I don't think this is true at all. I mean, there's no evidence that Jesus came under the influence of Greek philosophy and that he knew about the Cynics and that he modeled himself after the Cynics. I mean, there's no evidence for this at all. There are some slight parallels between Jesus and Cynics in that he did not always go along with the rules of his society, but there are a lot of philosophies that do that. He did not carry a purse to collect money, whereas the Cynics actually did. Anyway, I frankly don't know anybody who's followed him on that. But back when I first made these PowerPoints, 20 years, probably more than 20 years ago, probably it was more like 22 years ago that I made maybe 23 years ago that I made this PowerPoint before it was a PowerPoint. I mentioned John Dominic Crossan's theory, but as far as I know, nobody's been convinced because there's zero evidence for that. Okay, there's zero evidence for Cynics in Palestine at the time of Jesus. Sorry, John. I don't know John. Okay, Epicureans. So if the Cynics were one kind of offshoot of kind of Socrates and that tradition, the Epicureans are another one. And the founder of, again, there's another person who was a contemporary of Socrates who had Epicurean-like ideas. But the word Epicurean comes from Epicurus, who again, after Plato and Aristotle, he founded the Epicurean movement. And the Epicureans were called the garden philosophers. They were called the garden philosophers because, wait for it, they often met and talked in a garden. Epicurus liked the thinking of Democritus. In our first video, I talked about Democritus. Democritus is the one who gave us the idea of atoms, uncuttables, that everything basically reduces to uncuttables. And if you remember, Democritus believed in soul atoms as well. He didn't believe in eternal soul atoms. He believed in life, basically, let's call them life atoms. And that when you die, your life atoms, basically disperse and go into somebody else. Not reincarnation. These are not personal soul atoms. These are life force atoms, if you would. And so Democritus did not believe in any kind of an afterlife of any kind of personal, in terms of a personal continuity. There was an impersonal material continuity, but not in other words, your stuff gets passed on, but none of you gets passed on, according to Democritus. Epicurus agreed. And therefore, Epicurus believed that we should not fear death because there's nothing in death but ceasing to exist. And you won't know it. And so there's nothing to fear about death, according to Epicurus. Epicurus believed that pleasure was the highest good. And you may have heard of the word, again, words take on their own meaning. You might have heard of the word Epicurean. He has very Epicurean tastes. That is not at all what Epicurus himself was like. Epicurus thought that the kind of pleasure that Epicurus liked was the pleasure of contemplating deep thoughts. And now Deep Thoughts by Epicurus, but they weren't funny. And so pleasure for him was actually quite reasonable, rational. It wasn't necessarily sensual. And so, and I mentioned that he said death is of no concern. And he believed that we should remove ourselves from the world because the world's just going to bring you down. You're not going to be happy if you get around people. He must have been an introvert. And so, again, his kind of philosophy was not particularly exciting. You may have heard a verse from 1 Corinthians 15, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Well, that is not Greek Epicureanism. That is Roman Epicureanism. So the Romans kind of said, man, Epicurus was boring. I mean, if we're going to die tomorrow, let's have fun. Let's party hardy. And so that was not Epicurus. That was some of the inheritors of Epicurus, especially within the Roman world. Now, the most famous Roman Epicurean is Lucretius. Lucretius lived in the 1st century BC, if I remember correctly. And he also was an atomist. He also was an Epicurean. He also did not believe in any kind of a meaningful afterlife. You might note that C.S. Lewis, before he became a Christian, had been at one phase, he says in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he mentions that he'd been enamored with Lucretius at a particular phase of his early development. Okay, so Epicureans from Epicurus. So we've had Cynics, we've had Epicureans, the Stoics. The Stoics are my favorite of the heirs of Socrates. And again, we could probably think of a person who was around Socrates who could fit this. But the Stoics, as they really got going, were founded by Zeno. Zeno, the founder of the Stoic school. They were called Stoics because they met underneath the colonnade or stoa of Athens. So Stoic comes from stoa, which are colonnades. That's where they hung out and talked. The academy, by the way, was named after, I think, the guy that donated the land, Academus. And the word academic comes from that, but it didn't mean, that wasn't what Academus's name meant back then. That came to mean that. Anyway, the Stoics, think Spock, if you know Star Trek, and not so much even the new Spock, but think the original 1960s TV series, Leonard Nimoy Spock, before Star Trek 3. So Zeno was the founder, and he uses language about this mind that governs the universe. For Zeno, there is this divine logos. Do you know what logos? That's in John 1:1. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. That's what John 1:1 says in Greek. And the logos, it's translated word in John 1:1. John 1:14, and the logos became flesh, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. So that you have this divine mind that governs everything, and everything has a destiny to it. And there are logos seeds in all of us. We all have a little bit of logos seed in us. Man, James, what does James say? And I think also 1 Peter, the implanted word. We are to let the implanted word grow in us. This is Stoic language that the book of James and the book of 1 Peter uses, and that John uses. This Stoic language. Now, I'm not in any way saying that James or Peter or John were thoroughgoing Stoics. They weren't, but they're using language that has a history that goes back to the Stoics. And basically, the Stoics believed that everything was logos, or the logos was in everything. Now, as I recall, Sophie's world calls Stoicism monism, but I never fully followed this, in the sense that there are parts of me that can resist the logos inside of me, which to me suggests that there's more than just the logos. So I haven't fully, I should study the Stoics more. I really should. Maybe before I die, I'll have the year of the Stoics in honor of Zeno. But Sophie's world will tell you that the Stoics believe that everything is one substance. Well, there's definitely one logos in everything. Now, because the logos has a dictation to the world. By the way, there's a hymn to the logos by one of the famous Stoics. I'm trying to remember. I think it's maybe Cleanthes, the hymn of Cleanthes, if I remember correctly. But this hymn to Zeus, where Zeus is a personification or a symbolic of the logos. This hymn to Zeus that I think Cleanthes wrote is very, I mean, we could pray it to the Christian God. It is very reminiscent of theism in the way it prays to the logos. So I'm not surprised that the early Christians may have seen some opportunity to use this imagery when talking about Jesus, for example. But the logos has a destiny for you. And there's no point in fighting it because the logos, it wins. Don't fight your fate, but rather love your fate. Amor fati, love of fate. This is something that the Stoics taught, that because there is a order to the universe, it's ridiculous to fight against the order of the universe. You're going to lose. Why do it? So you should try to listen to the logos seed inside of you. You should follow the logos seed inside of you. You should listen to the implanted word, the implanted logos that's in you. Some other famous Stoics, Cicero, who lived in the 1st century BC. I think he was executed in maybe 64 by Julius Caesar. I'm trying to remember, but anyway, may have been before then. But Cicero was executed for. It's not good to oppose a dictator unless you win, and he lost. Seneca in the 1st century. Seneca lived at the same time as Paul. In fact, there's a novel, Paul and Seneca, an early Christian novel, if I remember correctly. But Seneca here's a quote from Seneca: "To mankind, mankind is holy." Basically a humanist perspective, that humanity is holy because humanity has the logos inside of them. Seneca was probably a fairly good person. In fact, he was a very noble person, I would say. He was also put to death by Nero, by the way. I don't know why people do this. You think just because you were my tutor when I was young doesn't mean I'm not going to kill you, Seneca. Anyway, Nero put him to death too. But Stoics were people who thought, must follow logic, must follow logic. Marcus Aurelius in the 1st century AD, 2nd century AD, was a Roman emperor. Late 1st century, late 2nd century AD. He put the martyr in Justin martyr. So Marcus Aurelius was the one who put Justin to death. But he wrote Meditations, which is a Stoic work. You can get it. There is a sense among the Stoics of submitting to the righteousness of the universe, submitting to the will of God. So there's a lot of Stoicism that overlaps. The love of fate, for example, Paul says in Philippians 4, "I've learned to be content no matter my circumstances." Man, that could come right off the lips of a Stoic, because they believed in being content, whatever your circumstances, and submitting to your fate no matter what happens. They also believed in apatheia. I don't think I have this here, but they believed in apatheia, which is not apathy. Again, just because the word apathy comes from apatheia doesn't mean that the word apatheia means apathy, because time moves on. Apathy today means I don't care. I don't know. So you're dying. Who cares? I mean, that's apathy. Apatheia for the Stoics was do not let your emotions govern you, but be emotionless. Don't let your passions govern you. And this is why Spock, again, is a very good picture of the Stoic ideal, because he's in control of his emotions. Anyway, the Stoics. Well, I'm getting near the end, believe it or not. There was this thing, Platonism went on, like I said, but it didn't stay the same. So my next slide has Neoplatonism, which arose, for example, in the 1st century, 2nd century AD. I don't know why I keep saying that. I do know why I keep saying that, because it's 100s. It's the 100s, but 100s is the 2nd century, because you always subtract one. Anyway, no, you add one. So the 100s are the 2nd century. But Platonism went through some phases. And so Platonism and Stoicism got mixed around the time of Christ into something we might call Middle Platonism. So Plato believed that the world around us is a shadow of the ideal pattern. And the Stoics believed that there is a logos that governs the universe, and we all have seeds of the logos inside of us. And so the Jewish philosopher Philo, I call him a philosopher, would say that the word of God is the image of God. And then the word of God is the pattern for everything that is shadowy in the world. So it's like a 3-story thing, where Philo takes the idea of God, because he's Jewish, And then he takes the idea of the world as a shadow of the ideal, the thoughts of God, and so the logos is the shadow of God. The logos is the copy of God, but the logos is the pattern of the world, of the shadowy material world. So this is a synthesis. And I personally, as a scholar, have suggested, I'm not alone, but I mean, I don't think we're in the majority, that the book of Hebrews may have some Middle Platonic background to it. And in fact, I wonder if some of the Christology of the New Testament may have some Middle Platonic background to it. Well, Neoplatonism I mentioned. Plotinus, who lived in the 2nd century AD, the founder of New Platonism. He basically, again, he's a monist. He says everything that exists is light, and light emanates from God. And so everything that exists is, as it were, an emanation from God. God is the perfect good, and we all partake of that good. Darkness is the absence of light. Evil is the absence of goodness. The early Christian Augustine around the year 400 will be deeply influenced by Neoplatonic thought. So for Augustine, evil is not a thing. Evil is the twisting of something that's good. And so he is influenced significantly by Neoplatonism. Well, I end this video with a couple of different ways that a person can have experiences of God. Sophie's World talks about mystical experiences with God, a feeling of oneness with God. A lot of Christian circles react fairly negatively to the idea that we might have mystical experiences of God. And that's because they're thinking of what we might call Eastern mysticism. In Eastern mysticism, there is a sense of becoming united with God in a very, I don't know how to say it, a very real way. Whereas I would say in Western mysticism, it's more of a sense of closeness to God. Close to thee, close to thee. I come to the garden alone, and he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. Anyway, that's a mystical, again, you may not like calling it mystical, but by definition, that's a kind of Western mystical sense of God, of unity with God, not becoming God, although, again, there is a Greek Christian tradition called theosis, which is the idea of participate. And I mean, First Peter talks about participating in the divine nature, partaking of the divine nature. So that's biblical language. I feel a little uneasy with it, but there are mystical experiences of God. So mystical experiences of God are when you feel unified with God. Eastern mysticism is total fusion with God. Western mysticism is meeting with God, closeness to God, meeting with God. There is another kind of religious experience that I wanted to mention, and I don't think it's in Sophie's World. I think I added this because at some point in my training for ministry, I came across Rudolf Otto's, what is it? The holy, what is it called? Oh dear, my brain is getting really old. Okay, I'm not crazy. The idea of the holy. But anyway, numinous experience of God are the Isaiah 6, on your face, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. So if in mystical experiences of God, you feel very close to God, and this seems to be the most prevalent kind of experience of God I grew up with. The other one is like, don't come close to me, Lord. I'm a person of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. The Isaiah 6, Lord, woe is me, I'm undone. It's the Uzzah touches the ark and he gets fried kind of holy. Both of these kinds of experiences of God, I believe, are legitimate in different contexts. But it is, I think, helpful to have categories. I like categories in which to kind of process experiences of God. Well, this has been a video on Hellenistic philosophies, vaguely following, well, more than vaguely, following Sophie's World in its content.